Indus with Talat Farooq Awan
on BBC Radio Manchester and BBC Radio Lancashire.
Now, next week, we see the launch of the new South Asia Gallery at Manchester Museum, and members of the community took on the task of becoming curators and working on different themes and objects that could represent them. Now, we've had some really interesting stories come out of them, and one of the themes includes the world of science. And the focus will be on Professor Satyendra Nath Bose, the founder of Bose Einstein Statistics and the discovery of Boson. But to shed some light on the story and the science, I'm joined by Satyendra Nath Bose's grandson, Falguni Sarkar, who joins me in the studio. Hello, and how are you? And welcome to the programme.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
And you haven't come from too far, really, have you?
No, well, a bit. I live in San Francisco, but I've been involved with the project over Zoom and everything, so I feel intimately involved.
How excited are you about the launch, which is taking place next week?
Oh, very excited, very excited. It's just such a unique thing that they've done. Looking to the members of the community to, as opposed to, say, professional curators to put together the exhibit. I think the objective of the gallery is to really represent and reach out to the community. So as director, has done a really unique job of bringing in the community. So I think in that sense it's very unique as well, but it's very exciting.
Yeah, and I have to also owe up on this as well, because I'm also involved in the museum as a co-curator from the community. Nothing to do with my job here, but on a separate level. And I'm involved in the Empire and Movement anthology, and I gave my great-grandfather's army uniform for them to display and to tell his story. Or, well, a story that I'm not really sure about myself, but still discovering. Yes. But how did you get involved in this, and who was the first point of contact for you?
Well, my friend, or my wife's friend, both of our friends, Shuma Paul, she is a resident of Manchester. She was connected to members of the community who were doing this, and she thought that my grandfather's story, S.N. Bose, Satyendra Bose's story, would be very good to include. And she reached out to me, introduced me to the folks at the museum. And again, it was originally remote, obviously. And then as COVID hit, and everybody went to Zoom anyway, so it seemed more natural that I be involved. And so we talked about a number of things. There was a wide range of topics around science and language and innovation. A lot of those different things. And, Bose is not the only scientist, of course. There's Ramanujan, who will also be represented. And for
those who don't know, what was his achievement?
Well, it's hard to say. He was just such a kind of polymath. And, Ramanujan, just a mathematician. He does a lot of amazing things. He worked with G.H. Hardy here in the UK. And he came up with a lot of theorems and principles that were quite revolutionary. But I don't know if there's one thing that I could really point
out. Right.
But the movie The Man Who Knew Infinity was about him. So that's with
okay.
I forget his actor's name, I apologize. But it's actually quite worth watching.
Right. But let's focus on your grandfather. And this is Professor Satyendra Nath Bose. Tell us about the science and Boson and how he became friends with Einstein.
Sure. Well, there's a big age difference. I wouldn't say friends so much as, obviously colleague. So Bose was born in the late 1800s, 1894 in Calcutta, part of British India at that time. And he was an exemplary student, always placing first in many instances. And he was very involved in, a lot of the youth activities happening in Calcutta at the time. And then when he graduated, he was part of the Calcutta University. There was a lot of brilliant students there at the time, kind of the late teens at that time. And then after he finished and graduated from university, he got a job at Dhaka University, which was now Bangladesh, but then East Bengal. And so he moved there in the early 20s, and he had a lifelong relationship with one of his childhood friends named Meghnad Saha, who's also a well-known astrophysicist, has an area of astrophysics named after him. And they kept in constant contact. And one day Meghnad Saha asked him to think about Max Planck's law. Everybody in physics knows about Planck's, law, Planck's constant, having to do with, black body radiation and whether light's a particle or a wave.
Okay, well, that's an education to me today.
Okay. Yeah. And so, one of the big questions is light a particle or a wave? And they talk about the duality of light, photons. And so Planck's law, or Planck's constant, was an attempt to find that out mathematically. And what Bose discovered was there was some inconsistency in the mathematics. And Planck had done his work in the 1800s, before Einstein came onto the scene in the early 1900s. And so for the longest time, people just lived with that inconsistency. And so what Bose did was he developed a type of mathematics, or statistics, to work out that inconsistency. And part of the assumption there was that certain particles are what they call indistinguishable. So light, for instance, you can't distinguish one particle from another, as opposed to other particles which they make up solid objects that are indistinguishable, that repel each other to form solid objects. And then but light, on the other hand, is indistinguishable, so they kind of meld together. So they could form, say, like lasers and things like that. And so what Bose speculated was that that requires a different way of counting particles. And then so he devised a new type of statistics based upon these particles being indistinguishable. And that's a very simplistic way of doing that. But the mathematics worked out. And so he, obviously very excited, he was a young professor, he sent it to the British Philosophical Magazine, and he didn't hear back from them. And for whatever reason, probably because they didn't quite understand, the implications. So he did what any young, South Asian living in the periphery of empire would do. He just sends it to the greatest scientist in the world, Albert Einstein, directly. And he said, "Respected sir, we are all your students, and I've written this paper, would welcome your opinion, and if you could translate it into German, and which was the language of science, of course, at that time, early 1900s, around the 1920s. 1924 to be exact, I would be eternally grateful." And interestingly, this wasn't Bose's first touch point with Einstein.
Yeah. But interestingly, and just looking at the information, he would receive hundreds of letters from all over the world with various queries and wanting to demystify some of the science facts around it.
Right.
But he replied to your grandfather.
Right. No, that's the amazing part. He was by that time obviously a celebrity, scientist. He had won the Nobel Prize, or awarded the Nobel Prize in 1921. So, he was, the top scientist in the world, and had done a number of things, not just done one thing. And so, it was amazing that this small 4-page paper, struck him, and he basically said, yes, it makes sense. It's a beautiful step forward. He himself translated it into German and published in the Zeitschrift für Physik, which was the top science magazine. And Bose actually sent him a second paper as well, which he also translated. Einstein translated. So there's 2 papers, one after another. The second paper Bose thought was much better, but Einstein had a slight disagreement with it, and he articulated it, and so it never really got the traction. But I think subsequently, historically, it showed that Bose was correct in his interpretation of one particular point. Right. And so that opened up the whole world for him. All of a sudden, he had Einstein's letter, and so he applied to go to Europe to go meet Einstein.
And this was his first trip away from India.
First trip away from India. He was 30 years old, and he had a very difficult time, interestingly, to get a visa or a scholarship to go. So because he was already married at that time, and so there was some restrictions the universities there had, where they didn't encourage married people to go. They wanted unmarried people to go, and so they could spend time, etc. But because of Einstein's postcard that basically said this was a beautiful step forward, he was granted a visa, and he went to Paris first in 1925. And there he met, Marie Curie and de Broglie and Sylvain Levy and all sorts of interesting, French intellectuals of the time. And there's an interesting story with Madame Curie where, he was introduced to her by one of the people that he met, Sylvain Levy, who was a famous Indologist, and a connection of theirs. As he met, Bose was, he was a very gregarious and very social, but kind of naturally shy shy, to begin with. And so Marie Curie just went on and said, "Oh, we'd love for you to have work here, but you'll have to learn French. So you should leave and come back, learn French, and come back." And he was too kind of intimidated, I guess, to say that he knew French. He knew French. He knew German. All of that was self-taught because at that point, if you wanted to learn, read any science or do any science, and this was before English became the language of technology and science, and so German, you had to know German, you had to know French. So he had self-taught. So he left, and then he came back later and said, "Oh, I've learned French," and he worked with her in his lab and stuff. And then a year later, he went to Berlin, and that's where he met Einstein.
And what can you tell us about the meeting with Einstein, and what sort of conversations did they have? And is there anything he kept any personal record?
Yeah,
your grandfather?
He had some recollections. He wrote some letters to some friends in Paris. He never himself had a picture taken with Einstein, interestingly enough. It was the same thing with Tagore. He was very close to Tagore. In fact, Tagore, Rabindranath Tagore, the great poet from India and South Asia, he actually, when it's a little side story, when Tagore met Einstein, Einstein said, "Oh, how is that bright young man Bose?" This was after he had met Bose. And Tagore didn't know Bose. And then he was thinking there was another scientist named Jagdish Chandra Bose, who was a generation previous. And he had done interesting work around radio waves. And some say that, he was the kind of inventor of the radio, but Marconi,
Marconi got
the credit and stuff. And of course, he built an, radio empire, which was, a tremendous contribution, Marconi. But Tagore says, well, there's not, J.C. Bose is not a young man. So he asked one of his people who work for assistants to go find this Bose and bring him. And so then, found, and the assistant knew of Bose. Oh, that's Satyendra Bose. And so he actually brought him, and that actually tickled Bose's mother to no end because a great poet had reached out and invited her son. But in terms of Einstein, there are other people's recollections, his recollections to friends and letters and things. Very congenial. Einstein asked him, well, how did you kind of come up with this? And at first, Bose didn't know or realize the kind of significance. And nobody really did, not even Einstein, until he actually did more work on it, of his contribution. And so he attended symposia. He met Heisenberg and Schrödinger and all of the kind of great scientists of the time that we all know about, and he formed lasting relationships with them. But he never. Einstein was famously very kind of what's the word? When you read his biographies, he loved to work on his own. He wasn't a very big collaborator, per se, and so he didn't really have a chance to kind of collaborate on actual work. But the work that Bose started, Einstein himself called it Bose statistics. So he didn't call it Bose Einstein statistics. It was only done after that. And then the name boson was termed by Paul Dirac, who was another English physicist. And who had himself made contributions. And so there's two types of particles in the universe. There are bosons, which are half the particles in the universe, and then the other half the particles are called fermions, which follow a statistics of Fermi Dirac, Enrico Fermi, the Italian physicist, and Paul Dirac. And so all particles in the universe are either bosons or fermions. And so, we like to say that, Bose owns half the universe.
Half the universe. I was going to say, how wonderful is that?
BBC Radio Manchester and BBC Radio Lancashire.
Joining me in the studio is Falguni Sarkar, and he is the grandson of Professor Satyendra Nath Bose, who is the discoverer of boson. And we were just discussing how that is half the universe. Mm-hmm. Now, I know heavy on the science, and we're getting there, and I'm getting an idea of what this actually means in the greater scheme of the universe. But I think let's bring it down to the personal level, and that is the impact your grandfather has had on the family itself and on his achievements.
Yes, so, Bose was famously humble and almost to a fault. And so as a family is, the same way. And so there is a lot of pride obviously, in his achievement, but not a lot of kind of fanfare or anything like that. Bose himself, during his lifetime, he worked on so many variety of things. He was not a institution builder like some of his like Meghnad Shah, for example, was very famous in building institutions, building organizations. That the institutions themselves being their legacy. Bose worked on a number of different scientific work. He spent a long time teaching. That was his passion. He spent most of his career in Dhaka, which was Dhaka University, which was kind of created as an alternative or a balanced university to Calcutta University, and so he basically did a lot of in teaching there. After partition, he came back to Calcutta. He also had a passion for language, and he had his theory was that in order for young people to learn science, they had to learn it in the mother tongue, and that was the best way to learn it, not to learn it in a foreign tongue like as his generation had to do. So he was an advocate for that, teaching language.
I suppose probably reflecting on his struggles with French and German.
Right, learning that. And, a lot of these things are conceptual, and so some of the language that is used to describe certain phenomena is based on your understanding of language and what words mean. But, the funny thing is, sometimes when you directly translate, the words come out kind of odd sounding that you wouldn't think makes much sense. And so, it was, I think, a very strong effort. I think it made a big impact. But obviously, the language of science and technology globally has become English, and in order to be competitive, one obviously has to know English, especially now with the way technology is, and you want to work in the global economy with outsourcing and all of that type of stuff. And so, there's kind of a mixed interpretation. But he was very earnest in terms of if you want to really understand the science, as opposed to just memorizing and things, it should be done in your own language. So those were his legacies. Also, one would imagine it to be quite intimidating to be known as, a Bose's kin. It's like a lot of expectations
exactly.
Are there. So,
no pressure there,
no
basically.
Pressure, right. So I had, the fortune to be raised abroad. I was born abroad, and then I grew up in the U.S. I moved there when I was 5 years old, so I didn't have his shadow, over me. And whenever I talked to obviously my friends and my family knew who he was, but when I talked to parents of my friends, peers, and they had no idea. And so I thought, obviously he must not have been, that famous or anything. And so, life went on until I got older, and I started reading more, and I, obviously took science classes, saw his name. And then I used to go into bookstores or libraries and find every book on Einstein and flip to the index, and his name was there. And so amazing. I'd like to show people, even if it's just one line, like it was usually like Indian physicist Satyendra Bose sent Einstein a letter and things like that. And so, so that was a moment of pride. There's a funny story with my uncle, Bose's son, youngest son. He came to the U.S. to study in USC, University of Southern California. And then a topic was happening there where Bose's name came up. And one of his fellow students pointed to my uncle and said, "Oh, that's Bose's grandson." And the professor goes, "Don't be ridiculous. Bose was German." And so this was early 70s, right? Late 60s. And so before that consciousness was there. So a lot of people pronounce him Bose,
right.
or Bose or something, to make it sound more German. But now, of course, the Bose name for Bose speakers, and everybody kind of knows the name. It's kind of what people know, but that's obviously a different Bose.
No doubt he's recognized in India, but now he's going to be recognized here in the Northwest as well, in particular, and features in Manchester Museum. How does that make you feel? Yeah, no, that's very exciting. That's and it's also very exciting to the family. That level of recognition. I've been working on a book on Bose. I have a website, snbose.org, where I've collected some information and more to come. And the family has this wish or this desire to have his life memorialized in book form. And there are a number of books already. There's a number of books in Bengali. The central government has written the books. There's a nice 2-volume set done by the Bose Institute in Calcutta. That's there, but nothing from a
a family perspective. And so that's something that I've been working on and hope for many years. So hopefully something will come up.
Well, do let us know when that is out, and it'd be lovely to speak to you about that in the near future. It's been a real pleasure speaking to you, and an honour actually to renowned world scientists and their grandsons here in Manchester. So good luck with the launch, and no doubt we shall catch up with you again at the museum as well.
Yes,
but it's been wonderful, and thank you for sharing your story of your grandfather.
Thank amazing. You for the invitation.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you. You're listening to Indus here on BBC Radio Manchester and BBC Radio Lancashire. The time now, it's at 7:28.
Indus with Talat Farooq Awan
on BBC Radio Manchester and BBC Radio Lancashire.